You open your banking app. You move some money into a savings account your spouse doesn't check. Maybe you've got a drawer with a little cash in it that isn't technically anyone's business but yours. It's not illegal. It's barely even sneaky. Worst case scenario, someone finds out and you have an uncomfortable conversation over dinner. Now imagine the person who finds that drawer is a king, and the conversation that follows isn't uncomfortable. It's fatal. Your land is seized by sundown, your title is erased from the record, and your head is separated from your body sometime before the following Tuesday. That was the actual, literal stakes table for being rich in most of human history. Not the taxman might audit you. Execution, confiscation, your entire bloodline erased from the ledger of who owns what. And here's the question nobody really sits with. If you were sitting on a fortune and the single most powerful person in your world could legally kill you and take every coin of it whenever he felt like it, what would you actually do with your money? Because you couldn't just leave it in the vault with your name on it. A visible fortune was a target, a rumor, an invitation. Kings didn't need due process. They needed a reason, and reasons were cheap. Heresy, treason, sorcery, owing the crown money it claimed you owed, being a little too popular at the wrong dinner party. The charge barely mattered. What mattered was that once it landed, everything you owned became the crown's problem to solve, and the crown always solved it in the crown's favor. So, the ultra-rich of the ancient and medieval world did something that feels almost modern in its cleverness. They stopped keeping their wealth in forms a king could actually grab. And the ways they pulled that off are stranger, sneakier, and honestly more architecturally brilliant than almost anything your average offshore account manager is doing today. Let's start with the single biggest problem wealthy people had for most of history: land. Land was the primary form of wealth for centuries, and land has one very inconvenient property: it doesn't move. You cannot hide a manor. You cannot slip an estate into your coat pocket when the tax collector shows up. If your name was on the deed, your name was on the target list.
So in medieval England, lawyers, and yes, lawyers have been doing this exact job for close to 1,000 years, invented something called the use. Here's how it worked. Instead of owning your own land outright, you would formally transfer legal ownership to a trusted group of friends, monks or associates, while you continued to actually live on it, farm it, and profit from it. On paper, you owned nothing. In practice, you owned everything. The men holding the title were using the land for your benefit, hence the name. If the king came looking for you specifically, there was nothing in your name to seize. The land technically belonged to a rotating cast of other people, none of whom had committed your alleged crime. This wasn't a fringe trick. By the 1400s, so much English land had been quietly shuffled into these arrangements that the crown was losing a staggering share of its expected feudal revenue, the death duties and inheritance taxes it depended on when a landowner died. Kings hated it. Henry VIII hated it so much, he passed an entire law, the Statute of Uses in 1535, specifically designed to collapse the whole system and drag that hidden wealth back into the open where it could be taxed and controlled. And what happened next tells you everything about how this game actually works. Lawyers took about 1 generation to build an even more sophisticated version of the exact same trick, and that new version is the direct ancestor of the modern legal trust that every wealthy family on Earth still uses today. The king won a single battle. He lost the war permanently.
Now, land was the slow, structural version of the problem. But what about wealth you could actually carry? That's where the merchants come in. And merchants had a different kind of exposure entirely. Picture a wealthy trader in a city-state like Venice or Genoa in the 1300s. His fortune isn't sitting in one visible pile. It's spread across ships at sea, warehouses in 4 different ports, and debts owed to him by men in cities he's never even visited. This looks, on its face, like exactly the kind of scattered, borderless wealth that would be nearly impossible to seize. But it created a different vulnerability: borders. The moment your gold physically crosses from one territory into another, it passes through customs, through toll gates, through the hands of local officials who answer to a local ruler. And every single one of those checkpoints is a place where a fortune can be noticed, questioned, and confiscated on the spot. The solution merchants developed was quietly one of the most important financial inventions in human history: the bill of exchange. Instead of physically transporting a chest of gold coins from Florence to London, a merchant would deposit money with a banker in Florence and receive a piece of paper, a promise, redeemable for an equivalent sum from a partner banker in London. The gold itself never moved. It never crossed a single border, never passed a single checkpoint, never sat in a cart where a duke's men could discover it during a routine and suspiciously convenient search. All that crossed the border was information, ink on parchment that meant nothing to anyone who intercepted it, and everything to the two bankers who could read it. A king could confiscate a wagon. A king could not confiscate a debt written in code between two men in different countries who both had every incentive to keep their arrangement quiet.
This is also, not coincidentally, exactly what the Knights Templar were doing 2 centuries earlier, running what amounted to Europe's first international banking network. A pilgrim could deposit money at a Templar house in Paris and withdraw the equivalent in Jerusalem without ever physically carrying a coin through bandit-infested roads or hostile checkpoints. And when King Philip IV of France decided in 1307 that he wanted the Templars' wealth for himself, he had to have every Templar in France arrested on the same coordinated morning on trumped-up charges of heresy, specifically because their money wasn't sitting in one seizable vault. It was distributed across a network held together by trust and paperwork. And paperwork, it turns out, is a lot harder to burn down than a castle. Then there's a category of hiding wealth that is almost embarrassingly simple, and yet it worked for thousands of years. Just make it small and make it disappear. Precious stones, gold coins buried in ceramic jars beneath a kitchen floor, rubies sewn into the lining of a coat. Throughout the medieval and early modern world, archaeologists have unearthed thousands of buried coin hoards, and historians widely believe a huge number of them represent exactly this instinct in action. Someone somewhere heard that soldiers were coming, or that the tax collector was arriving with an unusually large escort, or that their name had come up in the wrong conversation at court, and they buried what they could and hoped to come back for it. Many never did, which is precisely why we're still digging their emergency funds out of the ground today, 1,000 years later, in fields across England and France and the Low Countries.
Jewish financiers in medieval Europe understood something about this game that almost nobody talks about, and it's genuinely one of the darker chapters in this entire story. In much of medieval Christian Europe, Jewish communities were barred from owning land and largely excluded from most guilds and trades, which pushed many into moneylending, one of the few economic roles left open to them. That same exclusion made them extraordinarily useful to kings who needed cash for wars and could not legally charge interest themselves under Christian doctrine. But it also made them catastrophically vulnerable. A king could borrow enormous sums from Jewish lenders and then simply expel the entire community, or worse, canceling the debt in one stroke of a decree. England expelled its entire Jewish population in 1290 for exactly this reason, among others, and French kings did it repeatedly through the 1300s. So the wealth that survived tended to be the wealth that was never sitting still in the first place. Gems small enough to sew into a hem, portable bills of credit, and above all, extended family networks stretched across multiple kingdoms, so that when one crown turned hostile, capital could already be somewhere else by the time the decree was even signed. And this brings us to something that connects almost every one of these stories, whether we're talking about English land trusts, Italian bills of exchange, or family networks stretching across kingdoms.
The single most effective way to protect a fortune from an absolute ruler was never really about hiding the gold itself. It was about hiding the connection between the gold and your name. Kings were extraordinarily good at seizing things that were labeled, a vault with your family crest on it, a ledger with your signature at the bottom. What they were much worse at seizing was a web of obligations, trusts, and promises where no single piece of parchment told the whole story, and no single official in any single jurisdiction had the full picture.
There's a wealthy merchant family in Renaissance Florence, the kind of family whose fortune moved between Rome, London, and Bruges without ever fully resting in any one of those cities. If a pope grew hostile in Rome, the family's exposure there was, by design, only ever a fraction of the whole. The rest was already elsewhere, already promised to someone else, already tangled in enough legitimate-looking obligations that unwinding it would have taken a small army of accountants the crown simply didn't have. Complexity itself became a form of armor, not because anyone could prove wrongdoing, but because untangling the truth cost more than most rulers were willing to spend. Here's what makes all of this land differently once you sit with it. Every single mechanism we've just walked through, the trust that hides ownership behind a name that isn't yours, the instrument that lets value cross a border as information instead of metal, the practice of splitting a fortune across multiple jurisdictions so no single government can see the whole picture, still exists today, wearing a slightly different suit. The modern trust fund is the direct legal descendant of the medieval use, built by the same instinct to separate a name from the wealth attached to it. The offshore shell company chain that makes financial journalists' eyes glaze over is the bill of exchange's great-great-grandchild, value moving as paperwork instead of physical currency, precisely so no single jurisdiction can grab the whole thing at once. Even the diversified multi-country portfolio your financial advisor recommends for risk management is, at its evolutionary root, the exact same instinct that kept a Florentine merchant's fortune spread across 4 cities in case one of them turned on him.
We tend to think of offshore finance and complicated legal trust structures as a modern invention, some late 20th century innovation cooked up by clever accountants in air-conditioned offices. But the truth is almost the opposite. The tools are new, the instinct is ancient, and it was never really about greed or secrecy for its own sake. It was about survival, in a world where the person with the most power over your life could also, on a whim, become the person who owned everything you'd ever built. So the next time you read a headline about some ultra-wealthy figure's assets being tangled across a dozen shell companies in 3 different countries, and you think, why does it have to be this complicated? Remember the merchant burying coins under his kitchen floor, the lawyer inventing the use to save his client's land, the banker in Florence writing a promise no soldier at any border could ever confiscate. It has to be this complicated because for most of history, simple wealth was dead wealth. The complexity isn't the loophole. The complexity is the whole point. It always has been.